Okay, let's go. Excuse me. So we're going to wrap up two things from last time. And this was a very live research and clinical example of coercion that I just started to explain about negative reinforcement. And in a minute, we'll see why this is pretty important and why it might change your thinking about most of the rest of what we talked about in the last lecture. So again, negative reinforcement, seatbelt buzzer. It's annoying. There's an aversive stimulus. You shut it off by doing a behavior. So that behavior is what's called negatively reinforced. It's reinforced by that aversive stimulus getting terminated. Click the seatbelt, the buzzer stops. So the parent and child are interacting. A boy in the early elementary grades, maybe at risk for antisocial behavior, and Patterson defined as coercion two simultaneous chains of negative reinforcement. So the first, you can think of the parent. Well, I think I did the reverse last time. The kid is the aversive stimulus. The kid saying, no, I won't do it, I'm threatening to hit sister, and what does the parent finally escalate to do to shut it off? Wham, abuse. So what's the parent negatively reinforced for? Escalating to a hit to get the kid to stop clowning around. So from the kid's perspective, the parent is, would you do your goddamn homework? Do you think it's a free rent around here all the time? Come on, we're all part of a family. So the parent's nagging. And the kid says, man, I'm behind the eight ball in this family, nobody respects me. And if you don't do those chores, you'll be grounded for the next month, empty threat. And so the kid, this is now the kid's like in the car with the seatbelt buzzer going off. So how does the kid get the parent to stop? Shut up, Dad. Fuck you, I'll leave. Right? You know, pardon my French, but these are the kinds of aversive interchanges, coercive interchanges that Patterson documented. So the parent goes, okay, we're not gonna, okay, take it easy. We're not gonna have any violence around here. So what was the kid negatively reinforced for? Escalating to a swear or a threat to disrupt the house, and it got the parent to shut up, didn't it? So these are the two strands of negative reinforcement. The parent escalates to violence to get the kid to calm down, and the kid escalates to a threat or a swear or I'm gonna leave the house to get the parent to stop nagging. Negative reinforcement's powerful. Unless you do unhook that buzzer, you will put on that seatbelt to stop that annoying racket in your car. And the parents will escalate to get the kid to calm down, and the kid will escalate to get the parent to stop nagging. Coercion, so imagine what Patterson's research program is. There's either tape recorders or live observers in homes day after day, month after month, during these dinner times, homework interchanges, kind of normal everyday interactions, and the number of coercive interchanges, defined as these dual negative reinforcement chains, single biggest predictor of 10 years later is that kid in juvenile hall. So parenting shapes aggressive behavior. But if you think about it, what is coercion? It's both too lax, it's too permissive, and at the same moment, it's too authoritarian, it's too harsh. So Patterson's perspective is if you look at parenting in real time, some parents aren't just permissive all the time or some authoritarian and harsh all the time, but across a 10-minute interchange, some parents, especially those likely to have boys who escalate to pretty serious aggression, are too lax a lot of the time, and then they come down too hard and switch to an authoritarian stance that in the short term gets the kid to back off, but in the long term serves to reinforce that very behavior the parent's trying to stop. So in real time, really ineffective parenting may be a blend of, back to the earlier slide, seemingly, boy, authoritarian and permissive, they're on opposite ends of the pole, but actually a lot of parents don't know how to set limits very well, or then when they do, they come down so hard, it borders on abuse. So the message is, let's go back to where we were, that just getting a parenting questionnaire or having a clinician rate or trying to get an overall style of parenting may not tell the whole story. Real-time, interesting blends of too lax, too harsh put together. Now, if we had more time, we'd talk about, is coercion a causal risk factor? It's a risk factor because it occurred 10 years before the kid went to juvenile hall and it predicted it. So what Patterson would say to that is, if we put parents like this through pretty intensive training to teach them how to set limits that have teeth in them and how to reward their kids more so all the interactions aren't negative and to not escalate to the coercion in randomly assigned studies, those families, A, can reduce that coercion, and B, have kids who don't go to juvenile hall. So that's the closest we can get where you actually do an experiment to think that parenting might be a causal risk factor. So, final slide. Let's do something completely different. Family therapists say, okay, parenting, that's fine, permissive, authoritarian, authoritative, neglectful, but what about not just what the parent is communicating to the kid, but how the whole family system works? So family systems therapists talk about boundaries, and they talk about intergenerational divides. It's kind of a different language, and so this will be a very quick tour of this. If you've got a family, a nuclear family, of course there could be extended families too, the idea is there are some boundaries. The parents are the parents, the kid's the kid. As the kid gets older, it becomes somewhat more democratic, but parents should have a pretty healthy alliance between them. They should obviously have warmth and responsiveness to their kids, but not be so overindulgent of the kids that, as you see in some cases, it looks like dad and daughter really have an alliance and they're excluding the mom. That's what family systems therapists are really into. Boundaries, closeness, distance, generational divides. So if you take this to forming a typology, family systems therapists would say some families are pretty darn distant, meaning the boundaries, especially the across-generation boundaries, are pretty rigid. Not a lot of warmth and responsiveness, but it's not just the warmth and responsiveness, it's that there isn't the communication across those generational boundaries. This is a correlate of kids who tend to be externalizing. So you could say there's not enough warmth and responsiveness, maybe the parents are too controlling, you could map that onto authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, etc. But the family system therapist again would say it really is about who's communicating with whom, where the boundaries are, where the closeness is. And then the opposite extreme would be families that don't seem to have any boundaries at all. Everybody's a lot of love perhaps, but does anybody have any privacy and individuation? So this is called enmeshment. And enmeshment is a correlate of internalizing behaviors often. Eating disorders in teenage girls in particular are characterized by families who tend to not have too many boundaries, a lot of over-control of parents. Maybe the kid needs autonomy, and some would say, well, the teenage girl is asserting her autonomy to get the parents to back off through restricting caloric intake, keeping weight down, etc. It's really interesting. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the research point I want to make is, how do you know that it's the family alliances and boundaries that are causing the externalizing or internalizing behavior, or is it that maybe the family boundaries and closeness and alliances are the result of the kid's behavior? So if you've got a teenage boy who's right on that progression to juvenile hall, stealing stuff, can't trust alone in the home, aggressive, truant from school, maybe you distance yourself. Okay, sucker, you move out then, if you're such a big shot. So is the distant, not much love, big generational divide, a cause of or actually a consequence of the externalizing behavior. Similarly, if you've got a 14-year-old daughter who is progressively exercising 5 hours a day and eating a few wheat thins and not much else, you might tend to get pretty involved in her diet because she's going to starve herself. So did those family boundaries, those enmeshed, loose family boundaries, that over-involvement, precede the eating symptoms, or is it a response to them? The only way you'd know is to do what? Study families before the onset of these problems, follow over time, and see which produces which. It's a good example of what? Transactional processes. A lot of what we thought we used to know about families, well, of course, families are the cause, and if they act this way, the kid will act this way. Maybe, as we said last time, families are actually responding in this bidirectional reciprocal process. Questions on this? Coercion, family systems. Really interesting topics. We're just going into them lightly, but if you're interested, we can suggest readings in both of these areas, and some of you will go into family dynamics, family psychology, family therapy. Questions on this? Make sense? Everybody know what coercion is? Everybody know what negative reinforcement is? Family systems and boundaries? Good, it's clear, right? So let's get to today. And so now we're widening. We're widening from temperament, these early, seemingly inborn tendencies, to attachment, these bonds, and especially in the first year of life, to family influences longer in life. What about the peer group? After the ripe old age of 5 or 6, you spend more time with your peers than you do with your parents. So that's probably a pretty big influence. How you start to interact with peers and how you shape them and they shape you, it's a template for relationships later in your life. This is non-shared environment. Unless you're an identical twin, you don't have the same exact friends, and of course identical twins don't either. Kids within the same family have different friends and peers, so it's the classic definition of non-shared environment. And what do we know from several decades of behavior genetic research? Genes tend to matter. Heritability is moderate for most things we're talking about. Shared environment is actually pretty small, except for externalizing behavior, but non-shared environment, in some cases, has about as big an influence as genes seemingly do. So peers are the classic non-shared environmental factor. So, before we go any further, so are peers either a risk or protective factor, or, wait a minute, we don't actually live in a vacuum and peers descend upon us. We choose our friends. We choose whom we hang with. So are the peers the actual causal influence, or is it we, as we, that seems like a good person to hang with, I'd like to get close to him or her, good crowd to run with. Are we, with our earlier tendencies, selecting our peers who reinforce those same tendencies? It's another example of a reciprocal chain, transactional process. So, we'll talk a little bit about peer acceptance and rejection in the peer group, who likes you, who doesn't like you. We'll talk a little bit about friendship, close relationship, but again, it may not just be the sheer number of people who like you, the number of friendship, but the quality of these relationships. And that's where the research is headed in these areas. So, this is what we just talked about. The fancy term is selection bias. Oh yeah, sure, your peers influence you. Or maybe you really had a lot of influence on whom you selected as your peers, so their influence on you is related to whom you selected. So selection bias is a fancy term that means, is this outside influence really an influence, or have we selected, and therefore we've shaped that influence? So I'm going to give a key example in basketball of the three-point line. So in college basketball a few years ago, what happened? They moved the three-point line from 19 feet 9 inches, the top of the key, out another foot. It's harder. If you shoot three-pointers, that extra foot is a big difference. Now the pro 3 line is 23 feet 0 inches, and unless you're really strong and good, that's like a heave. But forget the pro three-point line. So the college three-point line, shooting percentages are of course going to go down when they move the three-point line out, right? They actually went up. Why? Is it easier to shoot from another foot? No, think of selection bias. If they move the line out another foot, who's crazy enough to try those shots? The better shooters. So you get sometimes paradoxical effects. If you change the environment, the three-point line, something kind of weird happens. The shooting percentage went up the first couple of years because only people who were really confident in their shot would take it. So it's a selection bias. Similar process. Don't get too confused about the three-point line when you think about friends, but you're going to try for that elite peer group? You're going to try for the popular group? Are you going to run with the druggy crowd? You're selecting maybe some extreme groups to be with, and maybe that's really going to reinforce those tendencies that made you select them. All right. What are sociometrics? So in psychology, there's a term called psychometrics, measuring the mind. Psychometrics is psych testing. IQ test, personality test, vocational preference test. Would you rather be a zookeeper or a librarian? Psychometrics. What's sociometrics? Measuring peer influence. So the classic way to do this with kids is kind of cool. You go into a classroom, the researchers come in, and they pull kids one at a time from the classroom and do a little interview that's totally confidential, no one's going to tell. And the old days, they did something called the class play. Your teacher's going to, the principal's going to put on a play in the school. Who do you think should be the lead actor? Who do you think should be the villain, the bad guy? And now it's a little more, okay, here's the roster of kids in your class. Who are the 3 kids you really dig and like the most? 3 kids you'd most like to be friends with. Kid nominates 3. Who are now the 3 kids you really don't want to be friends with? 3 kids you like the least. Now that's a sociometric because the kid is saying, I really want her to be my friend. I really don't want her to be my friend. You can also say to the kid, who are the 3 kids in your class who fight the most? Who are the 3 kids in your class who are the saddest? Now you're nominating peers, but you're nominating them to fit a behavioral description. So classically, and I'm making a big deal about this because it sometimes matters, a sociometric is a peer preference. I really want him as my friend. I really don't want that guy as my friend. A peer nomination of behavior is, I think that kid fights. I think that girl is pretty depressed. Or these are the 3 kids who pick on other kids the most behind their back. So you can do this by having the kid in this private interview pick the top 3 and the bottom 3. Or in another way, you could have the class roster, and you could say, okay, 1 to 5. 1, you really don't like this kid. 5, you love this kid. Every kid's rated on that 1 to 5 scale. So there's advantages whether you nominate the 3 most and least, or whether you rank everybody. But the idea is what? You're trying to get the whole class to give their preferences, and now you can figure some stuff out about the sociometric network. Usually in grade school, this is done, if you're a girl, you only rate the girls in your class. If you're a boy, you only rate the boys in your class. Why? Because most boys say, I don't like any of those girls, and the girls all say, the boys all have cooties or whatever, and so it screws it up. So usually this is done within sex. Sometimes if you want to do a sociometric study, the institutional review board, the ethical board at your university or research institution will say, hey, is this really good? Aren't you encouraging bullying? Aren't you encouraging kids to not like one another? You're asking the kids who the 3 kids that they dislike the most are. And there's been some interesting research done. you go into a school and you do these sociometrics in 3 of the 6 classes, and randomly you don't do it in the other 3, and then you observe to see if doing these sociometrics actually does encourage bullying or fighting. It doesn't seem to. Kids know it's confidential. The kids are doing this all the time anyway, right? They're all privately, let's gang up on her, or this guy we're going to keep on the outs, or let's be friends. So, but it's a big issue sometimes. Is this an ethical thing to do? Yeah. So that's what we're going to talk about now. What do you do with the information? Well, if you like dimensions, remember continuous rather than categorical. You can get, okay, there's 30 kids in this class, and I am in this class. 20 of my peers put me in the bottom 3. 20 of my peers said, don't want Steve as my friend. So my peer rejection score is what? 66.66%. 2/3 of the kids said, no dice. So I could do that for rejection, and only 3 of the kids wanted me as a friend, so I've got a 10% acceptance score. So that's one way to do it, get a sort of dimension. Or the classic way to do this is, okay, what did I just say? 20 kids disliked me. Only 3 liked me. What's 3 minus 20? Negative 17. My peer acceptance score is minus 17. 17 kids more hated me than liked me. So you can rank kids on this different score. We'll talk about what this means in a minute. There's another way to do it, which is to now make categories. Okay, most kids in a class, 1 or 2 kids friends with, 1 or 2 kids don't like. It's pretty average. Some kids, they get 10 people want to be their friends, and nobody doesn't want to be their friends. They're popular. Or the reverse, we're going to jump down to rejected. Nobody wants to be their friend, but 10 or 15 kids dislike them or don't want to be their friend. That's the rejected group. What about the kids that nobody seems to notice? They get no nominations either way. That group is called neglected. They don't seem to be in the peer mix. And then the final category, it's pretty interesting, is 10 kids want to be my friend and 10 kids can't stand me. I'm controversial, right? Controversial is an interesting category that we'll describe a little bit later in the course. So, let's jump back. Whether you go dimensionally and look at rejection, the percentage of kids who dislike you, or the difference between positive and negative and those negative scores, or if categorically you take this rejected category, what does that mean? So, several big studies were done 30, 40 years ago in the United States. Not of kids with ADHD, not of kids with conduct disorder, not of kids with autism, in a whole school district. And the researchers were well funded. They went in and did these peer sociometrics in every classroom and got peer sociometrics on thousands of kids. They also did psychological testing. They also got the kids standardized test scores. They also got parent and teacher ratings of the kids. What variable was the single biggest predictor of whether the kid was in juvenile hall 10 years later, or had dropped out before 12th grade, or even 10 years after that, was receiving mental health care in their 20s and 30s? Peer rejection. The kids who in 2nd and 3rd grade, the majority of their peers said, don't want her as my friend. No thanks. So that high peer rejection score dimensionally, or being in this rejected group, that outweighed anything the psychologist found out. It outweighed the test scores. It outweighed the pediatrician's report. It outweighed the parent and teacher ratings. Peer rejection, the single biggest predictor of pretty important outcomes: school dropout, delinquency, and later pretty serious mental health problems. So what's the risk factor here? Peer rejection. It occurred way before 12th grade or adulthood, and it predicted bad things. Question? Yeah, this is a big thing. Popular. Yeah, everybody thinks that kid's popular, but is the kid really popular? What you have to do is you sort of have to believe these data. You say, if the kids say you're nominated, kid might really say, well, see, the question usually is, do you want to be this kid's friend or do you like them? Not, do you think the kid's popular? Sometimes you could do both. You could get the sociometric of, do you like the kid, and ask if they're popular, and they may not be perfectly correlated. So take a couple other questions in a minute. So peer rejection here is the risk factor, the single strongest in these district-wide studies. I mean, these are studies of thousands of kids. But what does peer rejection mean in 2nd and 3rd grade? Does it mean that what we should really be doing in clinical psychology and psychiatry when we want to do assessments is not hiring testers? We should be hiring 2nd graders. They're really good. They get it, who's popular and who's not popular, who's liked and who's disliked. So it might mean that peers are really the most sensitive because they hang with these kids all the time. They can tell who's aggressive, who doesn't read those social cues very well, who doesn't fit. Or does it mean something more? Does it mean that if you are rejected, if the majority of kids in your class dislike you and don't like you, does that variable itself predict later bad outcomes? So you think of, if you're not doing well in school and you get kicked out, it's hard to catch up academically unless you're really intensively homeschooled. If you're rejected by your peers, it's like being expelled from the peer group. How are you going to ever learn social skills? So one of the questions is it just that peers are sensitive assessors? Or is it that the act of being rejected by your peer group is actually a causal risk factor? Now, a couple questions right here. Right. There's a lot of other factors. Are the parents encouraging friendships or not? What about older siblings? What kind of neighborhood do you live in? So you're absolutely right, but we're just considering peer rejection now. And it turns out to have a stronger predictive value than all those other things. Right here. Yeah, so let's look developmentally. 2nd and 3rd grade, this is when you do these assessments. But you'd like to know if that peer rejection at that age predicts it in middle school and in high school. Logistically, it's hard to do sociometrics in high school because you've got to go to 9 different classes, right? It's very hard to get approval to do it. It does seem to be a pretty stable factor. Question here.